discuss the impact of the global semiconductor shortage. I'm joined by Suresh Acharya. He is professor of practice in the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. Hello, Suresh. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Bob. Good to see you.
And thank you very much for joining us again. Just to start out with this whole issue of the semiconductor shortage, explain to me what the situation is as it currently stands.
Sure thing, sure thing. So, there's a lot of, news around it, but before we talk about the problem and where we might go with this, let's actually understand the lay of the land because it's an industry that is relatively opaque to a lot of people. We go buy potato chips, we don't necessarily go buy computer chips. And so, while we consume it directly or indirectly through computers and through other devices, it's an industry that the general population is not quite aware of. So if you kind of break it down into the supply side and the demand side, the supply side first, which is the one that's a bit more opaque, you have fabless semiconductor companies that really focus on and that have greatly specialized on the design of semiconductors. So these are the Qualcomms, the Nvidias, the Broadcoms of the world. They don't necessarily manufacture their chips over time. They have chosen to design and to really push out the manufacturing to companies like TSMC's in Taiwan. And these are pure play foundries. Foundry is just a term for semiconductor plants. And what these companies do is they take in orders from all of these fabless companies and others, and then produce the chips themselves. So TSMC is the big elephant in this space. One thing to note is that over 90% of the chips manufactured in the world comes out of Asia. So, keep that in mind. So any little hiccup that happens from that side of the world, whether it is driven by natural disasters or by, things like the pandemic or, national political issues, can have an impact here, right? So so we talked about the pure play, the TSMCs, the design only, and then there are companies like Intel and Samsung that are IDMs. They design and they manufacture, but increasingly, at least, their share is not as large.
Okay, so
So
that's a good succinct description of the supply chain as it exists.
yeah.
So you mentioned the possibility of a hiccup. Is that indeed what has happened? Why are we in this shortage situation right now?
Well, because on the demand side, the folks who actually order these semiconductors or these chips, they've had an impact due to COVID. So let me just walk you through the demand scenario and then where this has arisen, right? So we understand the Apples of the world because we all buy smartphones, and so they are a consumer of it. Microsoft and Sony because of the gaming devices, consumer electronics, medical devices, wireless, all of those digital devices. And increasingly now, and this is where this whole issue comes to the fore, is that the auto industry is now increasingly reliant on semiconductors. And in fact, the way to think about cars now is really that it's a smart device on wheels, because it has so many of these sensors and these chips. And so now the question is, okay, so all of that makes sense. Suresh, understand the supply, understand the demand, but what really happened? Even pre-pandemic, because of the previous administration's stance against China, we had already started to see some impact on this particular industry, and it was very much in flux. But once the pandemic hit, what happened was some of the supply side players started to have supply challenges. They were managing that because, like I said, 90% of it comes out of Asia. But when the pandemic came home, the demand patterns fundamentally changed, and in particular, the auto industry was very hard hit. People were not buying cars, and as a result, the auto industry decided to pull back its orders of semiconductors. A lot of other companies did that as well. However, their demand patterns ended up being the reverse. With people staying at home, gaming devices, consoles had a spike in demand. With kids staying at home and Zooming, if you will, there was a higher demand for laptops now. And so these consumer electronic companies started to fill in the void that the auto industry left by canceling their orders, and they ordered more and more chips. Now,
more than filled in the void, then, right?
Exactly, because their demand was high. Now, it's not necessarily exactly the same chips, but these foundries needed to change the semiconductors from what the auto industry needs to what these other industries needs. So fast forward from Q1 of last year to Q3 of last year, 2020, when all of a sudden now people started seeing the end of the pandemic, at least, in terms of the vaccine arriving, the stimulus checks started to come. And now the auto industry really saw an uptick, a considerable surge in their demand. Mm-hmm. And when they went back to the semiconductor companies saying, hey, give me the chips that I need, they said, oh, we're already tapped out.
Yeah, because the game industry's not going away at that point to make room for the auto industry to come back in.
Exactly.
So,
exactly. Mm-hmm. And so now what has happened is that these semiconductor companies, they are very capacitated in that they need to run in full utilization, and they are running in full utilization. It's just that the mix has now changed a lot more to the consumer electronics, laptops, gaming, and less than planned for the auto industry. And now that's what we hear.
But in addition to the types of demand shifting that you just described, were there also actual disruptions in the supply of chips at all because of this temporary closure of factories in China and elsewhere? Did that not contribute to the problem as well?
Yes, it did. So on the supply side, we talk about just the manufacturers, but remember, there needs to be raw materials that needs to go into producing these. So some of the earthquakes in Japan had an impact. Some of the closures in China, like you said, had an impact. What also happened, Bob, as a result of the previous administration's stance on China, is that a lot of the Chinese companies started to stockpile because they knew that there was an imminent shortage. Right. And so that has added to this shortage as well. Just like, we saw, end consumers go and buy toilet paper at the beginning of the pandemic, companies also stockpile or they hoard, and that then adds to the already delicate supply balance issue of computer chips.
Got it. Okay, so we've been up to this point, we've been talking about the market and market disruptions. Along comes the Biden administration with an executive order targeting several critical supply chains for review, one of which is semiconductors. What actions could the Biden administration take in the wake of such a review to address this specific problem and this issue and solve the problem?
Well, in the near term, I would say very little, Bob, because this industry isn't one where you can just quickly build a foundry. There are Intel has decided to invest in building more. Even TSMC has, and so yes, it can encourage these things to happen, but it's not an industry where these companies just mushroom overnight. And so it really is more of a reallocation, rebalancing than it is anything else. In the long run, I do not think it is healthy for 90% of the semiconductor manufacturing to happen, overseas. Some of that needs to come where the demand is. Remember, close to 50% of the demand is here in North America. Only 12% of the manufacturing happens here.
Well, is it economically feasible to do that, to reshore a substantial portion of production back to the United States?
Well, so therein lies one of the challenges that lean manufacturing has brought upon us. So lean manufacturing makes all the sense, all the sense in the world in normal times, but increasingly, supply chain experts are saying, look, it's more important to diversify and to be resilient so that you are not prone to a single point of failure that might happen in certain geographies of the world. And that should that happen, you are better prepared. And so that is one of the mitigating factors that it's increasingly discussed, to not have single points of failure, which, lean manufacturing has brought upon us.
Okay, so some aspect of some contingent of domestic production is probably necessary going forward. But as you point out, that's going to take a long time to build up that capacity. Do we have any short-term solves for this problem, or we just have to wait it out and let it kind of settle?
Well, if you see what's happening, the auto industry is already cutting back production, right? So they've got cars, but they don't have the smarts in them, and so I don't see this this issue going away right away. However, there will be a new balance that will emerge. Some of the companies that have stockpiled will obviously stop ordering as much. That will free up some much needed capacity. But this is a very cyclical industry, Bob. This is not the first time that we've seen semiconductors have an imbalance in supply and demand. It happens all the time. It happened in 2018 with a lot more demand than supply. Then in 2019, there was a lot more supply than there was demand. So it happens all the time, given the nature of it. But this particular issue around auto industry having issues, I think it will stabilize a bit, but we won't see the end of it until at least end of the year.
Well, not the most promising message, but some hope maybe in the future, especially as the pandemic abates and things get back to some semblance of normal, if we can use that word anymore. In any case, Suresh Acharya, good to have you back. Thank you, Sarah, very much for helping to cast some light on this critical topic. Thank you for being with me today. Appreciate it.
Sure thing, Bob. Thank you.